Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining me this evening. Our topic for this session is the future of volunteering, no less. And it's a topic that I've done 2 chief exec breakfasts on so far. Probably the first time that I can remember I've done the same topic twice in a format, and actually certainly the first time that I've done it back to back. So we had a session in September and a follow-up session in December, and I think that's testament to the sheer scale of interest and the level of relevance of this topic across the sector right now, particularly in light of the surge in interest and the surge in volunteering that we've seen during the pandemic. And my guest to talk to us about it this evening is Catherine Johnstone, who's the Chief Exec of Royal Voluntary Services and one of the people who was really at the forefront of that wave of interest and trying to find ways to bring all those volunteers safely into different parts of the organisation, particularly into the NHS. So I'm going to introduce Catherine to us all. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us. And I'm going to just ask you to begin with, if you could just sort of set the scene for us a little bit and just talk to us about your experience, the experience of leading RVS through those early months of the pandemic.
So at the beginning of the pandemic, Royal Voluntary Service has been here for 83 years. We were set up in response to World War II to support communities while all the men were away fighting, and it was largely women. And we mobilised about 2 million women across World War II to actually do all the things to keep the home fires burning, as it were. And we've been doing that ever since. So we're part of the emergency response when there is a crisis. But of course, usually a crisis, whilst you know about the crisis and it's usually in one particular area, you don't really get to see all of the organisations, both from the state and from the charity sector, and often from the private sector now, that will move into that space. Probably the best one to think about at the moment is Grenfell, pre the pandemic, where there's been a lot written about it and a lot about how everybody mobilised. Else. So Royal Voluntary Service is usually in there somewhere and supporting communities to regroup in their resilience, but also to deal with some of the very practical issues. In peacetime, when we're not doing emergency response, then we're out there delivering services largely in support of the NHS, social care and the wider communities to help people stay well. So we were very well positioned because of our relationship with the NHS to respond to NHS England's call for a emergency response system to help support the patients who were all exceptionally clinically vulnerable, who were going to be told that they needed to shield. So we were commissioned before the patients originally in the pandemic were told that you've got to stay at home. So this was before national lockdown, the first one, back that far. And therefore, we wrote a programme in partnership with GoodSam, which is an app provider, tech provider, and NHS England to look at how we would utilise volunteer effort to do the very practical tasks that people would need to keep them at home, safe and well and connected. So it wasn't a particularly difficult journey to write the programme, because actually we had huge confidence that volunteers would want to step forward. But I think what captured everybody's imagination was when we went out to recruit volunteers nationally, and in less than 4 days, we had 750,000 people indicating that they wanted to join what was then now known as NHS Volunteer Responders. And that was a bit of a phenomenon, and it was a moment in time. And actually from that, circa 400,000 of those volunteers actually went on to volunteer in England, and about another 50,000 went on to volunteer in Wales and Scotland. But not everybody who stepped forward went all the way through their application to transacting into the volunteering role. However, it's still a very, very big sample, and it demonstrated how by capturing the imagination of people who were at home or worried, wanted to protect the NHS, and wanted something to do with their time, we actually mobilised quite quickly and efficiently and started to meet the demand that then came through the floodgates for people who were then suddenly getting letters and saying, you've got to stay at home. What's interesting, of the 250,000 patients that we've supported, 80% of them have no other form of support. Now, these are clinically extremely vulnerable people. And that is sort of a reflection, I think, that many of you will be able to share about the value that volunteers have brought to the frontline service delivery, because there is I think pre-COVID, there was a working hypothesis that the volunteers were on the periphery. They were the nice to have, not the essential. I think that's one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the emergency response across all of our services and much wider, is that volunteers are an essential part of the support for the crisis and will therefore be an essential part of the support for the very long road through recovery, particularly for those who've had their conditions exacerbated or found themselves unwell as a result of COVID and non-COVID, or who people are just struggling to regain the confidence to come back.
One of the most sort of striking things, I think, of the work that RVS really did with Good Sam was the kind of development of the app, the micro volunteering type tools. Talk to us a little bit about what that does and what that enables you to do.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that pre-COVID, Royal Voluntary Service was probably at the lower end of the spectrum of what they would call being digitally capable. So, we were not an organisation renowned for our, innovation in digital tech or fundraising, or our online services. We had a few, but not many. So I guess it's worth holding on to, because the NHS had a lot of foresight when they commissioned us, because we had a tech provider that we were going to develop the app with, but they said, could we work with one that was already within the NHS? So Good Sam predates the COVID, and the Good Sam app, which was just for use with emergency ambulance provision, worked with the Ambulance Trust. So that was very helpful, because they already had a pre-existing relationship with the NHS, and that proved to be very, very important in terms of the credibility of the app and the credibility of the safety and security of the app when dealing with vulnerable patients and the patient data. So in terms of referrals, it was a blinder really from the NHS to actually ensure that happened. That being said, whilst there was a pre-existing app, it was not a what I call the dating app. So it wasn't designed to match volunteers to patients and tasks. That's not what it had been set up for. So we wrote, I think it was about 700 pages of user requirements in less than 2 weeks, in order to do all of the journeys that volunteers and patients would need to go on in relation to what were originally the 4 roles that were available for volunteers. So actually, it really was a good partnership, because we had tech who understood how to make it work. We had us who understood how to write the user requirements in a way that the tech provider could get a hold of them and make the code changes and put all of the tables together in the right way. And then the third part was that the NHS were dealing with all of the patient data and how we brought all of that together.
What does that?
So I think
what does that app allow you to do?
It was also so the app is downloaded onto most devices. So it's on open source and Google. It allows the volunteers to decide when they want to volunteer. So, and that has been the hugest benefit of the app from a volunteering perspective, because once it's downloaded, when you are ready to volunteer, so you have all your credentials, they're all in the back end of the system. I switch my app on at 6 o'clock, and that tells the system that I'm available. And if I've got my credentials, say I'm there for check-in and chat, community response and patient driving, they will match me, the system matches me to the next available job within a certain geographic radius. And those are all set up in the background in the app. So it very much does the matching. It also means that volunteers are in charge. So it's not that they've got to volunteer at 10 o'clock every Wednesday or on Friday at 4 o'clock. They choose. And that's why you need mass. you need a lot of volunteers, and you need good geographical coverage. So I can tell you at any one time at the moment how many volunteers I've got available to volunteer this evening in Maidenhead. I can tell you how many switch the app on. We can pulse them and say, we need you. Can you switch your app on? We can communicate with them. From a referral perspective, it's proven to be very, very popular. We have done quite a lot of surveys of referrers now because of the speed at which the jobs are completed. So virtually every task is picked up within an hour of referral and is completed within 24 hours. And of course, because it was emergency response and because people need something to eat today, not in 3 weeks' time, or they need a check-in and chat or whatever, that response time was very, very important. And then from a volunteer management perspective, it's not perfect, but actually what it does do is it allows us to have a lot of data about the patients. We're supported by a call centre, and the call centre takes on average 2,000 to 5,000 calls a week. And that they come in from three sources. They come in from the patients, they come in from the volunteers, and they come in from the referrers. And then anything that has safeguarding or any challenges, whistleblowing or anything, we have my Royal Voluntary Service safeguarding team in the call centre. And they then link with the local teams in localities to make sure that patients are supported through whatever the challenges are. And we've dealt with nearly 6,000 safeguarding issues since the beginning of the programme.
So how many?
So it's much more responsive.
So roughly how many kind of volunteers have you got now using the app these days?
About 400,000 are using the app. And then we recently expanded to a fifth volunteer role, which is the steward role to support the vaccination programme. So we've got an additional 80,000 volunteers who are volunteering for responders to do the steward role in the mass vaccination centres. And we've also been working, I think Martyn's joined us actually somewhere on the Martyn's on here. So Martyn Houghton Brown, the Chief Executive of St John's, we've worked in partnership to actually support St John's to secure all of their vaccinated volunteers. Hi Martyn, I can see you.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's worked really well.
And that's challenged all of us, but has worked really well. And therefore, if you like, the technology has also forced us to work in deeper partnerships and deeper collaboration, which was obviously welcomed from St John's and RVS. The same with British Red Cross. I don't know if Mike's on this evening, but again, to get to a point where we would be able to share the tech both nationally and locally is something that is in discussion at the moment within the NHS, because it's a different type of access to volunteering.
That was one of the questions that I was going to ask, which is, we talked a lot about the NHS. Obviously, it's the area that you're most focused on. But in terms of the need for volunteers across the broader sector, what are you seeing on that sort of the wider front outside of the NHS?
Well, there are some key areas, and some of it gets picked up in our safeguarding team, actually, because we have seen. So the mental health of people who have been shielding or isolating, who have underlying health conditions, has definitely deteriorated quite significantly over the last 3 months. And you can tell that from the state of the safeguarding issues that are coming through and the calls for additional support. And our mental health colleagues in Mind and Rethink and other charities are trying to pick that up and deal with it. Food has been a massive issue, and food poverty. And I think it was Mike from Red Cross who said quite publicly recently that it has been shocking to see how many people are living with food poverty now as a reality, i.e. they cannot feed their children today or tomorrow, and if they can, they can't feed themselves. So volunteers needing to be deployed to food banks, food parcel deliveries, and this offer of food and emergency food has been batted around all the different government departments and all of the different health departments and local authorities and, during the pandemic, which has also not helped because the route to supporting people who have fallen into food poverty it's a symptom of usually of a much bigger issue or set of challenges that individual or family or extended family or whatever are facing. And it's been very difficult to deal with that. And volunteers have been a big part of picking up and responding quite urgently. And then, everybody will have heard about the, as they call it, the rise of mutual aid. There's a report that's been published quite recently that said that an awful lot of the mutual aid, very, very local responses, was as a result of people being clever about mobilising dormant volunteers. So volunteers who perhaps were support their child at a rugby club or whatever, who couldn't volunteer but were interested in still doing something locally. And actually that was very, very successful in terms of, flooding localities with additional capacity. I guess the challenge now for all of us, and we'll come on to this a bit later, is how do we learn from what has happened and the 12.7 million people who've stepped forward to volunteer in the last year and translate that into both recovery and then a stronger civic society. Because just from my bit of the forest, I've got about 600,000 regular individuals volunteering for me at the moment. And as a result of the pandemic volunteering, the diversity, the age profile, the communities that those volunteers are coming from are very different to how we would have seen them pre-COVID. And that's to be celebrated and harnessed if at all possible. We do not want, of the 12.7 million who stepped forward, about 4.6 million for the first time. So those are people who, if we could capture them and help them to find their next opportunity in the volunteering journey, or supporting their community, or however they want to describe it, that is a massive win for everybody, them included.
Let's come on to that in a second. I think just to come back to one of the things that you said there. So you talked about 12.7 million people, and I think that's one of the things that has really been quite remarkable, and a lot of people have commented about, is the sheer number of people that we've seen stepping up to the plate. And I think the question that I would be interested in your perspective on to start off with, you kind of touched on it in terms of the latent population. I mean, is it just the pandemic that's driving that? Is this just a moment in time, or is this a signal that there is a bigger sort of untapped potential that's always been there? I mean, what's your perspective on that massive surge in interest?
Well, I think there's obviously huge interest because volunteering is actually very good for individuals, so both for their physical health and emotional health. And therefore, when we know that an awful lot of the population have become disconnected for one reason or another, of finding themselves out of work, or are looking for other places to connect in their local community, then volunteering is one route through. So getting as many people to stay with the volunteering and bring friends is just a good thing anyway. Our civic society was declining pre-pandemic, and therefore, we've got an older cohort of population who are volunteering more hours, which is hiding the real underlying issue, is that volunteering was falling away quite rapidly as people aged and passed away or stopped volunteering. And actually, a huge amount of our service delivery pivots on the ability for volunteers to step forward to support the state. And therefore, if that was not a sustainable trajectory, and therefore there is a big group of people who, as you say, have surged, who may be interested in joining on for a longer period, the civic core, and continuing to do their bit in their community. But I guess I'd turn the question around the other way, because I feel this acutely as the Chief Executive of Royal Voluntary Service. This country has been rubbish, quite frankly, historically, of having a surge, good or bad, and then helping people to find new or continuing volunteering opportunities. Just look at the Olympics. We were going to have this massive legacy. So the thing is whilst we are coming out of crisis, thank heavens, we're not coming out of COVID. we're going into what is a long road for many, many people of COVID recovery. We're going into an economic downturn, and we know that exacerbates health and health inequality and social deprivation. So we're going to have a tough time, and therefore I think we all have to work together. So all volunteer involving organisations, all infrastructure bodies, we all need to work together to create opportunities for people to find their way into continuation of volunteering. And I use the term volunteering, but I totally accept that that's not the lens that everybody sees this through. It's giving your time, it's mutual aid, it's helping out, it's a neighbourhood scheme, it's a WhatsApp group, however you define your giving of your time. It's incumbent upon organisations like mine and ours to create a world where they're not jumping through the hoops 400 times. We're making it too difficult. We're putting people who've stepped forward for the first time back into their own community box and not helping them to see their route through. So I think it's for us to lose, actually, rather than for them. It's not the volunteers who've got to find it, it's us.
There's a few questions you've raised there. There's a few questions coming on the chat. I'll come back to those later, so please keep posting your questions in the chat. I will get to them. Just because you talked there about why volunteers volunteer, you touched on it, and the need that we have to try and engage them. And you talked about the previous examples of where we've had a surge and then things have dropped away. And one of the things that I talked about at previous breakfasts, which you were there, is around the kind of the motivation behind volunteering. And I know Centre for Ageing Better did some work around this, and other people have done work around this. And you usually find that what's extraordinary is that the motivations, the engagement drivers of volunteers are almost the same, pretty much the same as those for employees. So you've got your kind of big four, as I would call them, and some people will break some of these down into 5 or 6 or whatever, that are broadly around sort of purpose and meaning. That's one big driver. Affiliation, so social contact, relationships, etc. The affiliation piece, and appreciation as well. Skills, mastery of skills, personal growth, personal development. That's the third big driver. And the final one tends to be around autonomy and empowerment. And in my sort of observation and my research, that you find that people engage at different levels. There's very transactional level, a moment in time, a cause, a march, this whole slacktivism thing, I'll sign the petition, but and then I'll feel good about myself and I'll feel part of the in crowd. But after that, and there's the transactional level. There's the relational level where I develop a relationship with you, with your organization. I volunteer for my hospice. I volunteer for RVS. I do regular volunteering for this particular organization or this particular cause. And then beyond that, there's the sort of vocational level where I start to self-identify as, Martyn's on the call as a St. Johnner, or as an activist, as a community organizer. This is part of my self-image. I am one of these people that does. And I wonder whether, to what extent we understand how to enable people to move beyond this kind of initial response, the transactional. I was there for the Olympics. I did my bit during the pandemic, to actually building that relationship and developing that vocational attitude towards the sort of thing. So that would be my question to you, I guess. A, is that a good way of looking at it? Or is that the right way of looking at it? But B, how do you do that in practice?
It's a good dissection of what it was like pre-COVID. So the thing I've been saying quite a lot wherever anybody's wanted to listen is I think we have to accept that the landscape for volunteering has changed forever. So I have lots of conversations with people who keep talking about them, going back to normal and BAU and everything else. But I think we need to be careful what we wish for, because actually I think we have to. This is our opportunity to step up and say, okay, if you think about volunteering, and lots of different people describe this in different ways, so my way is not necessarily the right way, but you'll get the gist, is if volunteering and giving your time has got 2 benefits. One is for you as the volunteer, and the other is for the time that you're going to give to whatever it is you're going to give it to. If you think about the spectrum, you can do that at the most informal level and make a massive difference in your very, very local community through a WhatsApp group, helping with shopping in your local street, all the way through to very formal volunteering opportunities, like being a community responder for St John's Ambulance or a Samaritan volunteer, where you're talking about multiple hours at regular shift times with quite a lot of clinical or training and ongoing training. So I think what we have to do is we have to just take a step back and we have to redefine, what are the ways in which volunteers can access volunteering, and actually how do we make that as straightforward as possible? Because we're behind the curve as a charity sector. So many people are sitting back saying, oh, let's wait for the civic society strategy, the new one, the revised one, to be taken forward by Danny Kruger. Or is government going to publish a policy paper? Well, the volunteering agenda belongs to the sector. Volunteering is at the heart of the charity sector. The charity sector was set up to be complementary to the state. And actually, it was largely formed of volunteering for its first 30 years of its evolution. So, we need to think about it in a different way, and we need to reset how volunteering will work. And I think we have the opportunity, because COVID is going to be with us for at least the next 2 to 3 years in terms of the country's recovery and the impact of it. And therefore, we've got much more opportunity to help reshape the landscape, as long as everybody doesn't go into territorial meltdown, as we know we can do in the charity sector. And, no, this is mine, I've always done it this way, no, I won't get my funding from here, blah, blah, blah. Because for me, I'm just encouraging everybody to put the volunteers at the forefront and then the beneficiaries and then work back from there. The other thing is, I think we have to get rid of this idea that volunteers belong to us. And this has been really controversial, and I've had lots of people shouting at me over this one, for some people, and that's to your affiliation point, Martyn, there will be some volunteers who will feel very, very strongly that they want to volunteer for one charity, one organisation. They want to be lifelong Samaritans, for instance, and actually they're not interested in volunteering anywhere else, or they are, but they do that, and it's very compartmentalised. I think what we have seen over the pandemic is that people want to be cause-led, so protect the NHS. If you see NHS responders, they don't necessarily have to be joined to Catherine Johnstone as the chief exec of RVS for the rest of their lives. I don't own the 400,000 responders. They do have an affiliation to me at the moment because that's where they're getting their support from. That's where they get to go on the Zoom calls with the Queen, do all of that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I've got to challenge myself, because it would be lovely for RVS, wouldn't it, to have a cohort of 500,000 volunteers in peacetime. But actually, I've really, really had to sense check whether or not that would be right or not. And it wouldn't, because these are individuals. What would be right is to help all of those individuals to find a way into their next volunteering opportunity. And I'm sure some of them will be with RVS, because they tell us that we're doing a pretty good job at the moment with most of them. But equally, I am as committed to finding them ways to St John's or to Red Cross or to their local food bank or to their local volunteer bureau, where they could get 20 opportunities, whatever it is, because for me, the big prize is that they carry on volunteering. And that's what I mean about the landscape changing and the collaboration changing. It's why Martyn and Mike and I are painfully, even though, we love each other to bits, we are painfully going through the process of working out how our 3 organisations can passport our volunteers, subject to them wanting to be passported, between our 3 organisations later this year for winter pressures, because that would be good for them to get more experience, but it would also be good for the country because it allows us to have the capacity in the winter pressures programme where it's needed at the time it's needed, rather than only by silo of organisation. So we've all got to challenge ourselves, I think, to think differently and to do something.
And I think that point is exactly right. And a number of people are commenting on the chat to exactly the same effect as well, in terms of the organisations and the way that people are, I think David echoed your point on organisations belong to volunteers rather than the other way around, and the Rotary model that Amanda operates. I guess
but Martyn, I've got a question for you.
Well,
Martyn,
yeah.
Martyn, I've got a question for you. So you talked about business. And you do a lot of work with business. This is not rehearsed, by the way. Look at him; he's looking at me horrified. He asked the questions, not me. Is when I say we're behind the curve in the charity sector, my sense is that businesses, particularly big businesses, are already thinking about this. The amount of corporates that I have spoken to over the last 6 months who are talking about it not being corporate social responsibility anymore, but smart business or purposeful business. And they're revisiting all that CSR and corporate giving and now directing it to COVID recovery. It'd be really good to do you have a sense about any of that?
I do, yeah.
Because you do these with lots of corporates.
I do. And Kate sort of put a note in the chat as well about this, about very positive inputs from corporates around volunteering. And yes, so the answer is absolutely yes. I'm getting far more, because people have started to adapt to two forces. One is that employees are on furlough and they're volunteering more, but also from a CSR agenda, it's a very easy one to plug in because people have created these connections and they've created these things. And I was on a call with a whole bunch of entrepreneurs about 3 weeks ago, and one of them is a trustee in Ireland of a hospice, small group of hospices in Ireland, and he happened to mention this, and all the others were chiming in, and the ones that hadn't really thought about it, were thinking about it, they took it away to go, that's a really good idea, that's something we should do one afternoon a month or whatever it is, etc. So but that's only part of it in terms of where businesses are with this. I think there's another angle which doesn't get anything like as much coverage. So that's one to plug into. So if you're a non-profit organization, do build that into your conversations with businesses on your CSR agenda, because a lot more of them are really into it now than they ever used to be. The game has changed. However, I would say that there's another piece to this, which is the way that businesses use volunteers themselves. And I think there is a set of lessons to be learned there that goes beyond what we would normally think of businesses doing. And for me, this kind of tracks back to things like Wikipedia, which I know is not a business, but Wikipedia is created by volunteers, it's maintained by volunteers. Lego is, most of their product development comes from volunteers. Genuinely, it comes from volunteers. It comes from their Master Maker program, where people who are passionate about Lego, they'll run competitions. Send us your ideas, send us your designs, and we'll do a limited edition of the best one. And if it catches on, we'll start to sell it. When I think back of my kids on video games and this sort of thing, they will be if they're really into a video game, they'll join the beta testing program for the video game. So these are commercial businesses developing video games that people will sign up to volunteer to test the new releases before they come and find all the bugs, etc. And then they'll go into the beta testing forum, and they'll have all the volunteers there moderating the boards and collecting all the feedback, passing it on to the developers. Now, a few weeks ago, I had problems with my Virgin router for my broadband, and it came up with an error message. You type the error message in, and straight away, I'm in an internet forum moderated by volunteers. This is Virgin, this is not a small business. The same is true for O2. These are big corporate entities. If you want technical support, the first thing that they do is they will divert you into a kind of Reddit style thread-based forum where you're getting advice from technical experts, all of whom are volunteers. And within the tech space, a lot of this has come out of GitHub, which is a huge online community, 40 million members who share content, share development on that platform, help each other. And this idea of if you contribute a lot, you get extra stars. If you contribute and answer lots of questions, somebody will approach you. If you want to be a moderator, to moderate certain parts of the board, all of these things have almost status badges and privileges associated with them. But there is a huge amount of interest and activity now in corporate space of using what ostensibly are volunteers. They wouldn't call them volunteers, but effectively what is volunteer resource in order to provide a huge amount of technical support. If they can do it, and they build such a sophistication around it, around the sort of hierarchy, around the participants, the super participants. If anybody's ever read there's a book that Matt Hyde recommended to me. I shall remember. New Power, it's called. All of these organisations.
The Eternal Optimist.
It's called New Power, and all of these organisations are starting to harness this stuff. So yes, I would say, I know that was a very long answer, but I always see two distinct trends in business. One is about enabling volunteering through CSR for non-profit organisations, but another one is actually taking volunteering to a more sophisticated level to harness within their own R&D, crowdsourcing, funding, support, all of those sort of things. And I think within the second, there are an awful lot of lessons for us to learn about the sophisticated development of volunteer pathways. I don't know if that answers your question or over answers it.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. And if you think about other things that we've got to do. So again, Martyn's been doing quite a lot of work on volunteer leave, because actually coming out of the crisis but into the recovery, we still need our volunteers to be able to volunteer for the vaccination programs and for the community response and everything else. So we went to government and said, or Martyn initially went to government and said, we need emergency leave to be granted. Can you do it? And it's been an interesting journey. I don't know if Martyn wants to say anything about it, but it's those sorts of things where you start to get further into the organisations and talk about the value that volunteers have put upon them within their workplace, because it's good to be able to broaden your skills, improve your CV, all of that stuff. But I don't know, Martyn, do you want to say anything about the emergency leave stuff?
I think there is a tremendous opportunity before us to recognise the value of volunteering in employment. And so we made a very specific ask around people with skilled volunteering ability to be able to be released from their workplace because of the pandemic. But actually, I think the broader piece about engaging meaningfully with employers to say that fundamentally a good employer is going to have a volunteer release program, that when you make a contract of employment, a good contract of employment is going to include volunteer leave as part of that contract of employment. And there is no doubt that the government right now is really rich in its experience of employers providing volunteers, during their working lives. Now, most of that has come about as a result of furlough. But one of the things that I think we should absolutely capture from all of this is that we've learned through furlough the value of volunteers being released from employment in order to be able to contribute to their communities. Let's make that together as a sector a really strong narrative, not just for skilled volunteers in emergency situations like for St John Ambulance, but also for the wider sector and the role that volunteers have to play in building our communities.
I think that's right. And then one of the questions that I suppose is in my mind is how much more can we get from skilled volunteers that have areas of real expertise, IT and all those sort of areas, the infrastructure areas, etc., the areas that where the commercial organisations are harnessing volunteering is around their technical skills that are incremental to potentially what we have in non-profits. I've got some questions for you, Catherine, from the chat, if you don't mind. There's a couple of really good ones that are quite thought-provoking. There's one from Richard around the tension between local and national. And largely, on this call, most of us are large national organisations. Are there lessons to be learned from the pandemic in managing those tensions? This is for you, Catherine.
Yes. So, yeah, thanks for that. So I tread cautiously and I hesitate because there is currently a very live sort of conversation going on in government about national and local and, delegated authorities and localism and, getting everything down to the lowest possible level at a community, because that is seen to be the right thing. Equally, if there weren't national schemes, like we've seen across the pandemic, there would have been nowhere near enough volunteers mobilised in the way in which they needed to be mobilised in order to be a safety net to support the various different capacities and capabilities of each locality. So my view has always been that there needs to be a blend. And I used to work locally many years. So I like doing both, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But if you like, there are a number of things that we've got to get over at the moment. One being ourselves. So, I alluded earlier to the territory thing and everything else. If you look through the lens of what is in the best interest of volunteers, so I've got a sample of 12,500 volunteers who responded to me when I asked them what they thought about volunteering on responders. And one of the questions was about, do you consider yourself to be a national volunteer, a local volunteer, or something else? And virtually everyone, without any exception, ticked local. So there is a difference between being mobilised and organised, called to action nationally, where you can create big data, you can create safety nets, to being actually deployed then locally, versus this mantra that everybody seems to have, that a volunteer has to go through a local volunteer route recruitment process in order to be a valid local volunteer. And believe you me, I've had lots of discussions about this during the pandemic, because everyone said I'd stolen all the volunteers. That was the first thing that we had to go through. And of course, volunteer, the supply of volunteers is not the issue. If you ask volunteers what the issue is volunteers who want to volunteer finding their way to an appropriate volunteering opportunity in a time frame that makes sense without bending them completely out of shape. And that's why I say our sector lags behind, because we must do better. And that means we've got to get over ourselves about this tension between national and local. And obviously it's worse at the moment because it's playing out in governments and local government and everything as well. For me, the things that keep me up awake at night is, have I got enough volunteers to deploy to meet the needs of the services that we've undertaken to deliver, and the demand that goes up and down quite significantly at the moment, depending on what's going on with COVID. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is how, am I making it more difficult than it needs to be for volunteers to volunteer? And if I keep those as the two things at the forefront of my thinking and planning, I end up all the time in these debates about, well, should a volunteer bureau in Maidenhead be recruiting the volunteers for responders and then giving them to me rather than the other way around? I don't think the volunteers care, quite frankly. Actually, if the volunteer bureau had the capacity, that would be great, but there isn't a volunteer bureau in every community. So actually you don't get the national coverage. And what we've seen from the pandemic is communities have dealt with the pandemic in very different ways. There are three buckets. There is one set where they are very underdeveloped and have really struggled on just about everything and have been heavy end users of all the national schemes and support from their neighbouring local authorities and things. Relatively small, but perfectly formed. And actually, funnily enough, happens often to be in the areas where there's the highest level of health inequality and social deprivation. There's a finding. And then at the other end, there are local authority resilience hubs, etc., who are very well sorted and have dealt with the crisis and with supporting their communities and the individuals in their communities really, really well. But the biggest cohort is in between, where sometimes they can do that and sometimes they can't. And therefore, you need a blend of national and local, or local and national, depending on how you want, what lens you want to look at. And that's why I say we've got to do better, because we've got to work this out for ourselves and not allow governments and NHSs and, CCGs, PCNs the new integrated care systems that are not integrated yet, local authority for regional hubs, they all have their own lens, and the sector gets pulled between all of those lenses. Actually, the sector needs its own lens, would be my assertion. And I think now is the opportunity for us to harness that on behalf of our civic society.
I've got a couple of quite practical questions. I don't know whether you can shed some light on these. So
I love the one from Rachel. I like the one from Rachel about volunteer roles.
Yeah, that one. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, let's read that out because not everybody will have seen it, but it's a really, really live topic. Actually, Rachel, do you want to read it out? Find it in the chat. Where's she gone? It is Rachel, isn't it?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you.
Where are you, Rachel? Yeah,
I'm here. So it was a question because we are wanting to build up our volunteer. I'm in Dogs Trust, a welfare charity, and we're really keen to build up our volunteer network, and in particular use a volunteer network in order to build capacity. So have volunteers coming in, working with our staff, training them so they can then go off and do great things in their community. But we have a problem with this kind of, which I've had some great replies from the chat already. So thank you to everybody who's replied. We have this problem that our HR is telling us our volunteers can't do the same role as paid staff. So it's kind of inhibiting what we can do in that space. So I was really interested in your thoughts about how A, to get around that, or B, to create or how different the volunteer role has to be from the paid staff role in order to, I guess, achieve that objective.
Catherine, tell us.
Okay, yeah, it's a really good question, very live. So I wouldn't take it from one or the other, Rachel, or I don't. So I look at a people workforce, and in all the organisations that I've led, and many like Samaritans, RNLI, St John's, etc., you've got a workforce of staff who are paid. You also have a workforce of volunteers, and some of the roles inevitably will be crossing over in the middle. And I think that is where HR professionals get very nervous, because they try to create these sorts of defined boundaries. Well, if we tried to create, and I don't think Mark's on here from RNLI, but if we tried to create that boundary in RNLI, literally we would have no volunteer lifeguards on any of the beaches. We would have no volunteer lifeguards in the boats. We would have nobody saving people at sea. And the last time I looked, and I've said this to Mark before, the last time, if I'm bobbing around in sandbanks and I'm about to drown, when the arm comes over the edge of the boat, I'm not asking whether you're paid or unpaid. I'm just really pleased to see you, and either will do. So for me, it's one of the things where we've got to think differently. There was some work that was done last year by NCVO, which was really good work, where they were looking at working with the unions to see if they could create a sort of a concordat or anything. But that's been pushed out now, because obviously it's a very difficult thing to do if you're trying to create black and white boundaries. And it's in all of our best interests at the moment not to try and do that, because when unemployment goes up, unions and things get very nervous, as do HR professionals, about being cited around, bringing in someone to do a job that, as a volunteer, that a paid member of staff should do. So we've got a long way to go. There are no cast iron answers at the moment, but there is plenty of practice that demonstrates how it would work. I mean, Martyn has got now 30,000 vaccinators working alongside the clinic, volunteer vaccinators working alongside the clinical healthcare professionals in all the vaccination centres. You could argue that nurses and doctors and other clinical professionals could have been drafted in, but it was deemed that actually the clinical professionals needed to be doing something else, because giving the injections was actually something that a volunteer could do. So I think it's about the capability of the unpaid, of the volunteer, to be trained. So why shouldn't an ex-nurse or doctor be giving injections, even though they're not in the clinical profession anymore? why can't, Martyn's first aiders, Red Cross's first aiders, the cardiac responders, the first responders, they all give life-saving support. So if you start to knock all of them out because they're volunteers, then the state doesn't have enough capacity in order to deliver all the services. So I would always start with you need a blend of paid and unpaid, and you need to define your blurred area, your area in the middle, very carefully. But it's from my perspective, it's okay to have both, and actually, even if you bill it in the meantime as people getting the career opportunity as a volunteer to then be able to go on and apply for those roles somewhere else or whatever. I guess where it becomes more tricky at the moment is if companies and things have just done massive redundancy programs and then suddenly 200 volunteers pitch up to do the roles thing. So that is what everybody's got to be very cautious of at the moment. But increasingly, so National Trust, NSPCC and quite a few others are actually moving now to blend their workforces in the way that I've described. And they're looking at people directors rather than an HR director and a volunteer director. I had that when I was at Samaritans. You need the right person to be spanning both. But I would urge everyone to start thinking about it as a people workforce, not just as your staff or your volunteers. Because I think that blend is going to be really, really important.
And just very briefly.
Sorry, long answer, and no real answers. But
it was great, and you've also got some, as you say, some really good stuff in the chat. You've got particularly the thank you, Jane, for the offer as well for the offline follow-up. There was one little piece that I'd just be interested in your thoughts. Volunteer management. Volunteers managed by salaried staff or by a volunteer management structure. Some of the previous conversations that I've been involved in with this with chief execs is one of the important factors, particularly in the when we look at how do we create a more diverse volunteering base, how do we create volunteering which is more representative of our communities, how do we create a volunteering force where people who are different to the prevailing volunteer in terms of age profile or whatever it is, that they feel welcome, that culture of inclusivity. How can you curate a culture within your volunteering army, if you like, if it's all entirely volunteer managed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that question, that tension between volunteers, allowing volunteers to manage volunteers and the empowerment or autonomy that gives versus the ability to influence through managed staff. What are your thoughts on that dichotomy?
Okay, so I've had both, and I would say that a blend is a better end result. So at Samaritans, we were volunteer led, even down to the chief exec level. So the chief exec at Samaritans didn't lead; the senior volunteers led, and the chief exec did the bidding of the volunteers. Now you could argue that's the same for all charities if you read across to the trustee board. But actually, these are volunteers who were operationally active every day in the chief exec's office. So, I mean, that is a hard end volunteer-led model, but it works. Does it work when you come to inclusion and diversity? Well, Julie's not on here, so I don't know how they're getting on. But a lot of thought is going into organisations like National Trust, Samaritans, and things about how do you make your organisation open when volunteers who've been volunteering for years, who largely recruit volunteers who look and feel like themselves, because that's just what people do. How do you change that culture and that dilemma? So I think that that hard end probably is the harder end of changing the culture to be more inclusive. But there are lots of organisations out there who are doing that at the moment. At the other end, just volunteers being managed by paid staff doesn't necessarily work either, because that creates a hierarchy. And even if you don't mean it to, it's sort of paid is better and everyone does the bidding of the paid staff. So what the model I like, and the one that we're implementing at Royal Voluntary Service, is a blend. And actually you can have very senior managers as volunteers. And volunteers managing volunteers always goes down quite well. So a lot of volunteers manage recruitment at Royal Voluntary Service, because volunteers want to be rung back after they've made an inquiry by a volunteer who's already volunteering, because actually it's just a much richer conversation and a much better match. You need to put the systems and processes and everything in place. You need to be really on it with your safeguarding, your whistleblowing, and that's why I'm beginning to advocate for this combined people force, rather than, you've got a staff staff who are paid with their whistleblowing and everything else. And over here, you've got a safeguarding team and volunteer complaints and compliments and everything else. If we could manage our people as our people and put the right things in around them, I think we'll get much better results and a much better blend. And I'm a big fan. I mean, I stayed at Samaritans nearly 7 years, and you don't do that if the volunteers are driving you mad, although many of them will tell you that I told them often they were, is that, they're at the front line, they're doing the doing. And it's almost disrespectful a lot of the time to then just impose stuff from centre that it doesn't take on board their very rich and often daily experiences of being on the front line. I mean, that's the reality. So I'm very happy with either.
So there's a number of themes going through as we draw to the close of this, particularly around the fact we're not going to go back to normal. It's one of the things that you said, and that there is a huge opportunity here, and listening to volunteers, bringing volunteers into the sort of process and the management process of that sort of blended model, etc. You talked about a couple of other things as well, very pointedly, which is this is for us to fix. We can't wait for somebody else to write a green paper or to impose this. We need to take this forward as a sector, as a groups of individuals, and then that pulls into the final theme, I think, which you talked a lot about to begin with, which is this organisations working together, the collaboration that needs to happen within the sector in order to allow people to move between organisations, was passporting examples that you use, but also to create this sort of environment where people can volunteer, where people can access those volunteering opportunities. I guess sort of my final question to you would be, on that side of things, the collaboration side of things, where are you with it? How are you, I guess, stepping up to the plate on the challenge that you've articulated for us all? What are you doing about collaboration?
So we've revised our strategic plan, and we've gone from 5 outcomes to 3, because we decided we need to be pithier on it, do less, but do it really well and at scale. And we're just about to send that out with the board. Richard's here, the board have just signed it off. And we're sharing that with all our staff and our volunteers and being really clear about the priorities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we are collaborating at pace and scale with a carefully set of charities and businesses and things. So we've chosen quite carefully who we want to collaborate with. So things like the National Social Prescribing Academy, we're doing some work with them. We're working with St John's, with Red Cross on the passport. We've set up a group that's working. So Amanda, who's on here from Rotary, and others who are on here are in the Shaping the Future group, which is a group of large-scale national charities who have lots of volunteers. And there's about 20 of us working together on inclusion and various other, volunteer management, so that we get some economies of scale and we can move quicker and faster. And we're trying to connect better with the infrastructure bodies across all jurisdictions to work with others and with the membership organisations, so that we're not doing things in isolation. For most of the charities that I work with, they have quite a big local footprint. So Royal Voluntary Service was working in most communities pre-pandemic, either in the NHS or in the older people's community support sphere. So working out how we then engage locally. So for instance, we've just won a tender, now I won't say which area, with a new collaboration with a local Age UK, because we decided that we were doing similar work. So we approached them and said, would you like to go in for this tender? Now that halved the level of income, but it doubled the capacity. it meant we weren't competing, and we won 6 out of the 7 lots. Now that to me is win-win. So actually looking at, even right in the commissioning, is just thinking about who else could we go into business with to do the service provision, because that's what's better. How do we share what we're doing? Now, I've never spent so much time on these sorts of things. We're also, and Amanda will kill me if I don't mention this, so I and a number of others, and some of you, will either be attending or will be speaking at or running a workshop at Volunteer Expo, which is in May. So I think we all have to commit to being at things and being seen and be talking about volunteering. We're part of the Together collaboration, which is run by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was set up originally. It's got a really eclectic board. I'm on it, but ultimately it's actors, it's civic society leaders. It was set up to help with the community tensions around the perceived impact of Brexit, but was largely now been taken over by COVID for all the right reasons. So the Together campaign is going to run a volunteer celebration day on the 4th of July. And their convening power will get probably the best part of 10 million, and it will get every news channel, every local radio station, where we're all going to say thank you to all the volunteers that have stepped forward. And if you want to go to a party, or you want to go to a lunch, or you want to go to the biggest ever park run, if you want to have, whatever, national trust, property, however it happened, that collaboration allows everybody to share the richness of the power of volunteering and amplify the voice of volunteering. And I think that's going to be really important in July, because that's one of the hooks as to how to help people to find their next volunteering opportunity. Have you enjoyed being part of this? What do you want to do next? Not thank you for doing this, bye-bye. We've got to start creating those jump-off points. Volunteer Week, Expo in May, Volunteer Week June, and then this in July, and then whatever comes afterwards. We're doing a lot, but very happy to join in with others, and for other people to join in with what we're doing. I talk about it, they're not all my initiatives.
No, thank you very much. And Amanda's kindly put the link into Volunteer Expo, so check that out, and some of the other things that Catherine talked about there. We have overrun, and this is entirely my fault. Terrible moderation. I will call it there. Thank you. Finally, just time for me to say thank you all for joining us, and particularly for the great questions that we got through in the chat. A lovely round of applause from Richard. And thank you to Catherine. Thank you very much for spending the evening with us. The next session will be end of May, when I've worked out what it's going to be on. You will get an invite, and hopefully I will see you there. Thank you all. Thank you, Catherine, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Martyn. Thank you. Thanks. So lovely to see you all.